Alright, so this video is very definitional, talking about lines and transversals and angles with parallel lines and transversals. This is going to be a screen-only video today because it doesn't appear that my webcam is working, so we're just going to go with the screen. But there is quite a few definitions here, but it's important to make sure we have an understanding of what each of these words and phrases mean in order to continue on learning about lines and transversals throughout the unit. So to start, parallel lines are just two lines that are the same distance apart and never touch. So down here in these pictures, these arrows right here mean that these two lines are parallel. So they're the same distance apart all the way along the two lines, and they'll go on and on forever and never touch. Congruent angles is just two angles with equal degree measures. So two angles that are the same. And supplementary angles are two angles that add up to 180 degrees. I'll go ahead and fix this. Okay, so if we think about a straight line is 180 degrees. That's what this angle would be. So if I had an angle right here, for example, that was 30 degrees, I could find this angle by subtracting 30 from 180. So 30 minus 180 is 150 degrees. So it's just important to know that a straight line gives us 180 degrees. If we look at these next 5 words, our definitions are done with pictures instead of with words because I find that students kind of seem to connect with that a little bit better. So the first is alternate interior. Now I encourage you to, instead of just trying to memorize all of these words and their definitions, to think about what the words mean, and then you will likely remember their definitions. So alternate is just like switching, different, opposite. That's kind of the definition of alternate. And interior is like inside. So if we look at these two angles, they're alternate because one is on this side of the transversal and then it alternates to this side of the transversal. And interior, they're inside our two parallel lines. So these are alternate, switching one side of the transversal, other side of the transversal, and inside the parallel line, so interior. For your information, this line that cuts through, so these two lines are parallel, the line that cuts through it is called a transversal. So as I use that throughout the video, you'll know that that refers to the line that cuts through the two parallel lines. And then another example of some alternate interior angles would be this angle and this angle. So they're still alternate, they're still interior. Those would be alternate interior angles. And alternate interior angles are congruent, so they have the same angle measure. Alternate exterior angles, so we still have that alternate word, it still switches one side of the transversal, other side of the transversal, but now we are exterior, so we are outside those parallel lines. So another example would be this angle and this angle. And alternate exterior angles are also congruent. Consecutive interior. So interior, we've talked about that word already, means inside those parallel lines, but this time instead of being alternate, they're consecutive, one right after the other on the same side of the transversal. Consecutive interior angles are not congruent, they are supplementary, meaning they will add to 180 degrees. Corresponding, so corresponding, they're not, one of them's interior, one of them's exterior, so they're not necessarily both interior or both exterior like the other ones have been, but they are on that same side of the transversal. Basically, corresponding is the angles are in the same place in regards to each parallel line and the transversal. So right above the parallel line and to the right of the transversal is an angle, above the parallel line to the right of the transversal is an angle. Those two angles are corresponding angles, and corresponding angles are congruent. The last one is vertical angles, which are sometimes also known as opposite angles because they're opposite one another. When you have two intersecting lines, one is on this side, one's on the other side. So like if we looked over here, these two angles would be corresponding angles. And I forgot to go ahead and draw another pair of angles corresponding, so I'll draw one now. So those two angles are corresponding. So over here, these two angles would also be vertical, and vertical angles are congruent. So that's kind of a lot of definitions at once, but I think once we start to go through some examples, you should hopefully pick up on them pretty quickly. So we have a figure down here with two parallel lines and a transversal, and our angles are just labeled with numbers. So we're going to go ahead and go through each pair of angles and decide what type they are. Are they alternate interior, alternate exterior, consecutive interior, and so forth. And also decide if they're congruent or supplementary. So starting with angle 3 and angle 7, so that's here and here. So angle 3 and angle 7, well, they can't be any of the interior or exterior ones because one's on the interior of our two parallel lines and one's on the exterior. So that automatically knocks out those first three. So they have to be corresponding or vertical. Vertical doesn't make sense because vertical has to be opposite one another, and they're not. But they are in the same place compared from this parallel line in the transversal, this parallel line in the transversal. So these would be considered corresponding, and corresponding angles are congruent. And I'll just put a C for congruent. C for congruent and an S for supplementary. Angles 1 and 5 are in a similar situation. So one's exterior, one's interior. They're in the same place comparatively. So these are also corresponding, which means they're congruent. Angle 2 and angle 6 is yet another example of corresponding. So they are congruent. Angle 2 and 4, again, one's on the outside, one's on the inside, but this time they're not in the same place. They're opposite each other. So these are called vertical angles, and vertical angles are congruent. And then angle 1 and 3 are also vertical angles that are congruent. Angles 3 and 5, so now they're both on the interior, so I can look at alternate interior and consecutive interior, but they do alternate on either side of that transversal, so these would be alternate interior angles, which again are congruent. And then angle 4 and angle 6 are in that same situation, just on the other side, so those are also alternate interior, which is congruent. And the last one listed is angle 4 and angle 8, which one's inside, one's outside, but they're not opposite each other. These must be corresponding and congruent. So with all of those examples, we didn't see any that were alternate exterior, and we didn't see any that were consecutive. So I'm going to go ahead and point those out to you. Alternate exterior would be like, they have to be outside the parallel lines and alternate sides. So angle 1 and angle 7 would be considered alternate exterior, and angle 2 and angle 8 would be considered alternate exterior. Consecutive, and this is consecutive interior, they've got to be inside these two parallel lines and on the same side, right in a row. So like angles 4 and angle 5, and angle 3 and angle 6 are examples of consecutive angles. The last thing I want to talk about in this particular video is parallelograms. I basically just want you to understand the definition of a parallelogram and what properties parallelograms have. So a parallelogram is a quadrilateral, and quadrilateral, all that means is a four-sided shape. So any shape that has four sides is quadrilateral. So parallelograms will always have four sides, but those four sides have to be set up in a specific way. The first thing that needs to happen is opposite sides have to be parallel and congruent. So AB and DC are parallel to each other, and AD and BC are parallel to each other, and those same sides are also congruent. So AB is congruent to DC, and AD is congruent to BC. which basically just means they're the same length. Congruent is like a word for equal, but when dealing with shapes and sizes instead of just numbers. Opposite angles are congruent, so angle A is congruent to angle C, and angle D is congruent to angle B. And then consecutive angles are supplementary. So consecutive being those ones that are right in a row. So angle B and angle A are supplementary, and angle A and angle D are supplementary, and angle D and angle C are supplementary, and angle C and angle B are supplementary. So that's the basic structure of a parallelogram.